The late afternoon sun, usually a benevolent golden wash over Willow Creek Estates, felt more like a brazen interrogation today. It beat down on my meticulously manicured lawn, highlighting the almost imperceptible brown tinge creeping into the edges of my fescue. My name is Arthur Pendleton, and I am, by all accounts, a man of quiet routines and even quieter frustrations. My current frustration, however, was anything but quiet. It was a roaring inferno, fueled by injustice and a particularly egregious shade of beige. The object of my ire and the catalyst for this escalating madness sat like a smug plastic monument on my patio, my rainwater barrel. Or rather, what used to be my rainwater barrel. It was a handsome, sturdy thing, a deep forest green that complemented the earthy tones of my garden. It was my pride and joy, a testament to my commitment to sustainability, a small, personal rebellion against the relentless thirst of summer. And now, it was gone. Vanished. Pilfered. My gaze, however, was not fixed on the empty, sun-baked circle where the barrel had stood. It was locked, with the unwavering intensity of a hawk spotting its prey, on the pristine, immaculately maintained porch of Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle, 2 houses down. Mrs. Periwinkle, the undisputed queen of Willow Creek Estates, the architect of its draconian rules, the woman who, with a flick of her perfectly manicured wrist, could make a grown man weep over an errant weed, and the thief of my rainwater barrel. The evidence, though circumstantial, was damning. The barrel, a substantial 55-gallon unit, hadn't simply sprouted legs and walked away. It had been heavy, even when empty. Moving it would require effort, and more importantly, a certain disregard for boundaries. And who in Willow Creek possessed that particular brand of entitled disregard with such panache? Agnes Periwinkle, of course. It had happened yesterday morning. I'd woken with the pleasant anticipation of topping off my barrel, envisioning the cool, life-giving water I'd soon be showering onto my wilting petunias. I'd ambled out to the patio, coffee mug in hand, the morning dew still clinging to the grass, and nothing. The usual satisfying weight, the familiar green curve, the subtle scent of stored rain, all absent. Just an empty, sun-bleached circle. Panic, a cold, clammy wave, had washed over me. I'd checked behind the shed. I'd peered over the fence. I'd even, in a moment of sheer desperation, considered the possibility of a rogue squirrel with an unusually strong grip and a penchant for hydration. But the truth, as it often does, was far more mundane and infinitely more infuriating. My neighbor Brenda, a woman whose gossip network was more efficient than the CIA, had seen it. "Arthur, dear," she'd chirped, her voice a syrupy concoction of feigned sympathy and undeniable delight. "I saw Agnes's gardener moving something green yesterday morning. Big thing, looked heavy. He put it right on her back porch." Brenda's testimony was, unfortunately, irrefutable. Agnes's gardener, a silent, stoic man named Miguel who always wore a spotless uniform, was Agnes's loyal, unquestioning foot soldier. And Agnes, with her iron fist in a velvet glove, had clearly deployed him on a covert operation. My initial reaction had been disbelief, followed swiftly by a surge of indignation. Why? Why would Agnes Periwinkle, a woman who lived in a sprawling mansion with a perfectly manicured lawn that rivaled a golf course, need my meager rainwater? She had sprinklers that operated on a timer, a personal landscaper on call 24/7, and a private water well. What possible reason could she have for stealing a simple rainwater barrel? The answer, when it finally dawned on me, was almost more galling than the theft itself. It was about control. It was about rules. It was about Agnes Periwinkle's unyielding belief that her vision of Willow Creek Estates, a sterile, uniform utopia of perfectly manicured lawns and matching house numbers, was the only acceptable reality. My rainwater barrel, with its slightly weathered charm and its subtle nod to ecological consciousness, was an anomaly, a blemish on her perfect canvas, and Agnes Periwinkle, the self-appointed curator of Willow Creek's aesthetic, could not tolerate it. I had, of course, tried diplomacy. A polite, albeit slightly shaky, knock on her imposing oak door had yielded nothing but a chillingly polite dismissal from Agnes herself. She'd answered, a vision in pastel silk, her eyes, the color of glacial ice, surveying me with an almost imperceptible disdain. "Arthur," she'd said, her voice like the tinkling of wind chimes on a frigid day. "Is there something I can help you with?" "Mrs. Periwinkle?" I'd begun, my voice betraying a tremor I'd tried to suppress. "I believe you may have mistakenly acquired my rainwater barrel." A flicker of something. Amusement? Triumph? Crossed her face, quickly masked by a practiced innocence. "Your rainwater barrel, Arthur? I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to." "The green one," I'd pressed, feeling a bead of sweat trickle down my temple. "It was on my patio. Yesterday morning, your gardener..." She'd cut me off, her smile widening, but offering no warmth. "Arthur, my gardener is a professional. He would never misappropriate anything. Perhaps you misplaced it?" "Misplaced it? A 55-gallon barrel?" The sheer audacity was breathtaking. My carefully constructed composure began to fray. "Mrs. Periwinkle, I can assure you, I did not misplace it. It was taken." Her glacial eyes narrowed slightly. "Arthur, if you have concerns about your property, I suggest you contact the authorities, or perhaps the HOA. Though I must say," she'd added, her gaze drifting to my slightly browning lawn, "maintaining one's property in accordance with HOA guidelines is generally a more productive use of one's time." The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. My lawn. My slightly neglected, yet perfectly functional lawn. It was her subtle, yet devastating weapon. She was not just taking my barrel. She was reminding me of my perceived shortcomings, of my supposed inability to meet her impossibly high standards. I'd retreated then, my face flushed, my hands clenched into fists. The encounter had left me feeling deflated, humiliated, and incandescently angry. But as I'd walked back to my house, the sun beating down on my parched lawn, a different kind of heat began to build within me. A slow, simmering rage, fueled by a growing realization. Agnes Periwinkle, for all her power and influence, was not invincible. She was a creature of habit, a devotee of order, and her meticulously constructed world, I suspected, had a few hidden vulnerabilities. And that's when the idea, a wicked, audacious spark, had ignited in the dry tinder of my frustration. It was a plan born of desperation, a desperate gamble fueled by a deep-seated desire for justice, or at the very least, a satisfyingly messy form of retribution. If Agnes Periwinkle believed in strict adherence to rules, in the precise channeling of things, then perhaps, just perhaps, I could show her the consequences of misdirected channels. I stood on my patio, the empty space where my barrel had been a gaping wound, and looked across the manicured expanse of Willow Creek Estates. My gaze settled, once again, on Agnes Periwinkle's porch. A smug, perfectly symmetrical porch, devoid of any errant greenery, any hint of rebellion. A porch that, I decided in that moment, was about to receive a rather unexpected and decidedly damp delivery. The sun, I realized, was no longer an interrogator. It was a co-conspirator, its relentless heat promising a drought that would make my small act of defiance all the more potent. The battle for Willow Creek Estates, I knew, had just begun. The dry, crackling heat of the late afternoon sun seemed to mock my simmering fury. It beat down on my meticulously manicured lawn, a lawn that, thanks to Mrs. Periwinkle's discerning eye, was perpetually teetering on the edge of HOA violation. But that was exactly the point, wasn't it? It was about control. Mrs. Periwinkle, the undisputed queen of Willow Creek Estates, the architect of its draconian aesthetic, the self-appointed curator of every shrub and sidewalk crack, couldn't stand anything that deviated from her perfectly sculpted vision. My rainwater barrel, a symbol of my quiet, eco-conscious rebellion, had sprouted legs and walked away. Or rather, it had been relocated by Miguel, her silent, stoic operative, under her explicit, albeit unspoken, direction. Brenda's syrupy concoction of a voice, laced with the barely concealed glee of a cat watching a mouse squirm, had confirmed my suspicions. "Oh, Arthur," she'd trilled, her eyes darting with the furtive energy of a rogue squirrel. "I did see Miguel the other day, with a big, green thing. He was heading towards Mrs. Periwinkle's back gate. Such a strong man, isn't he?" The implication was as clear as the condensation on a chilled glass of iced tea. My barrel, my precious receptacle of nature's bounty, was now likely housing Mrs. Periwinkle's prize-winning petunias, or perhaps serving as a rather ostentatious doorstop for her sprawling mansion's side entrance. My confrontation with Agnes Periwinkle had been a masterclass in passive-aggressive warfare. Her porch, a pristine, immaculately maintained expanse that rivaled the finest putting greens, had been the stage. Her eyes, pools of glacial ice, had held no sympathy, only a cool, calculated appraisal of my disheveled state, my rising temper, and no doubt the slight browning at the edges of my fescue. "Arthur, dear," she'd purred, her voice the tinkling of wind chimes on a frigid day. "Are you quite certain? Perhaps you misplaced it, or perhaps—" She'd let her gaze drift pointedly towards my lawn. "The neighborhood's vigilance has inspired a more unified approach to landscaping. If you have concrete evidence, of course, the authorities are always an option." The galling implication was that my barrel, like my lawn, was an offense to her sensibilities, an eyesore that needed to be scrubbed away. But I wasn't going to the authorities. That was her game, the bureaucratic route for those who lacked the panache for more direct forms of negotiation. My mind, usually occupied with the gentle hum of sustainable living and the precise calibration of sprinkler systems, had begun to churn with a different kind of energy. It was a wicked, audacious spark, born of righteous indignation and fueled by the incandescent fury she'd so expertly stoked. It was a desperate gamble, a deviation from my own carefully cultivated order. But it felt right. It felt like justice. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a spectacle of natural beauty that Mrs. Periwinkle likely found a bit too chaotic for her liking. It was time. The plan, hatched in the crucible of my humiliation, was surprisingly simple, yet elegantly brutal. It involved a bit of DIY, a dash of ingenuity, and a whole lot of redirected potential. My gutters. They were, after all, designed to channel water. And what better way to return what was stolen than by channeling something else directly to the source of the pilfering? The rain was predicted for tomorrow night, a gentle, persistent drizzle that would be utterly harmless to my own newly optimized collection system, but a veritable deluge on an exposed, unsuspecting porch. I retreated to my garage, the scent of motor oil and damp earth a comforting balm after the sterile perfection of Mrs. Periwinkle's domain. My toolbox, usually employed for minor repairs and the occasional birdhouse construction, now held the tools of my impending vengeance. I rummaged through the organized chaos, my fingers finding the familiar heft of wrenches and screwdrivers. I needed an extension, a way to angle the flow, a conduit for my watery retribution. My gaze fell upon a length of PVC pipe, left over from a long-forgotten plumbing project. Perfect. It was sturdy, flexible enough to manipulate, and most importantly, it would extend the reach of my gutter's downspout just far enough to achieve the desired result. The existing downspout was on the side of my house closest to Mrs. Periwinkle's property line, a strategic placement I'd always appreciated for its efficiency. Now, it would become the launch pad for my counteroffensive. With a determined grunt, I wrestled the PVC pipe onto my workbench. I needed to create a secure, watertight connection. I found the necessary fittings, the couplings and adapters, and began the methodical process. Each click of the plastic, each tightening of the wrench, felt like a step closer to equilibrium. This wasn't about destruction. Not really. It was about rebalancing. It was about demonstrating that even the most meticulously controlled environment could be inconvenienced by the forces it sought to suppress. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across my lawn. The air grew cooler, a welcome respite. I worked with a focused intensity, the frustration that had gnawed at me all day now channeled into purposeful action. I imagined Mrs. Periwinkle, nestled in her immaculately decorated living room, sipping her Earl Grey, blissfully unaware of the impending damp delivery. The thought brought a grim smile to my lips. I attached a flexible elbow joint to the end of the existing downspout, a piece I'd cleverly purchased years ago for a different, equally minor, landscaping project. Then I connected the PVC pipe to this elbow. The goal was to create a downward trajectory, a controlled cascade that would bypass her manicured flower beds and aim directly for that pristine porch. I angled it slightly, a subtle adjustment that would ensure the water, should it rain as predicted, would flow with a determined, if not entirely aggressive, purpose. I tested the connection, running a small stream of water from my garden hose into the gutter. A steady flow emerged from the PVC pipe, a controlled stream that arced gracefully downwards. It wasn't a torrent, not yet, but it was a clear indication that the system would work. The sound of the trickling water was a sweet melody to my ears, a promise of vindication. As darkness truly began to descend, I surveyed my handiwork. The extension was discreet, tucked away behind a large azalea bush that bordered my property. It wouldn't be immediately obvious, especially to someone like Mrs. Periwinkle, who likely only ever looked at her neighbors' properties with a critical, judgmental eye. It was a subtle sabotage, a quiet disruption. I cleaned my tools, the residual heat of the day clinging to my skin. The air hung heavy with anticipation. The forecast, which I'd checked with an almost obsessive fervor, now seemed like a divine decree. Tomorrow night, Willow Creek Estates would experience a localized, highly targeted, and utterly deserved deluge. I walked back to my patio, the empty space where my rainwater barrel once stood a stark reminder of the injustice. But now, it was also a symbol of my newfound resolve. The absence of the barrel was no longer a wound, it was a strategic void, a testament to the fact that even the most entrenched powers could be challenged. I looked across the manicured lawns, the perfectly aligned houses, towards Mrs. Periwinkle's imposing facade, now silhouetted against the twilight sky. A faint light glowed in one of her upstairs windows. She was there, in her castle of control, utterly oblivious. A sense of quiet satisfaction settled over me. It wasn't the triumphant roar of a victorious warrior, but the subtle, knowing smirk of a strategist who had just executed a flawless maneuver. The game of lawn care and HOA regulations had just taken a decidedly aquatic turn, and Mrs. Periwinkle, the queen of all she surveyed, was about to receive a very special, very wet delivery. The thought sent a shiver of wicked delight down my spine. Let the rain come. The night air hung thick and heavy, pregnant with the promise of a downpour. I'd checked the forecast no fewer than 7 times, each scan of the Doppler radar a small, anticipatory jolt in my chest. It was going to rain. Oh, it was going to pour. And my gutters, modified with their new, strategically angled PVC extension, were primed. Primed and ready to deliver a message of watery, indignant retribution. I sat on my patio, the very spot where my beloved rainwater barrel had once stood, a gaping wound in my otherwise orderly existence. The phantom weight of it, the satisfying heft of a full barrel, was a phantom limb I now felt with every passing moment. The air was still, save for the insistent chirping of crickets and the distant hum of a lawnmower, a sound that always seemed to be Mrs. Periwinkle's chosen lullaby. It was a sound that normally soothed me, a testament to the neighborhood's adherence to her exacting standards. Tonight, it was an irritant, a mocking reminder of the pristine lawns and immaculate porches I was about to disrupt. My mind replayed the confrontation, the cool, dismissive tilt of her head, the way her eyes, like chips of glacial ice, had held no warmth, only a frigid assessment. "A rainwater barrel, Arthur? On your patio?" "I don't recall seeing that on the approved list of patio accoutrements, dear." The implication hung heavy in the air, a subtle threat veiled in saccharine concern. She didn't just enforce the rules, she was the rules. And I, with my little barrel, had dared to deviate. I had dared to embrace a touch of sustainability, a whisper of environmental consciousness, in a neighborhood where eco-friendly was synonymous with unapproved aesthetic. Brenda's confirmation, delivered with that syrupy concoction of a voice, had been the final straw. "Oh, Arthur, you poor thing. Yes, I saw Miguel, bless his heart. He's so strong, wasn't he? He was hauling something big and green over to Mrs. Periwinkle's place earlier this week. Said she needed some decorative planter for her patio. I thought, my goodness, that looks just like your barrel." Her little giggle, a sound akin to a gaggle of geese being startled, had done nothing to endear her to me. But it had confirmed my suspicions. It was unequivocally, gallingly her. And so, the gears began to turn. Not the slow, methodical gears of my usual routine, but the sharp, clanking, almost malicious gears of a mind pushed too far. It started with a flicker, a desperate spark born of pure, unadulterated frustration. Then, fueled by the memory of her condescending smirk, it ignited into a full-blown inferno of vengeful ingenuity. I'd spent the better part of the afternoon in my garage, a space usually reserved for meticulously organized gardening tools and spare parts for my sprinkler system. Tonight, it was a workshop of clandestine operations. The PVC pipe, a length of gleaming white, felt surprisingly substantial in my hands. I'd measured, marked, and cut with a precision that would have made Mrs. Periwinkle herself nod in grudging approval. If she knew what I was doing, of course. The elbow joint, the connector that would bridge the gap between my existing downspout and the new clandestine channel, felt like the key to unlocking a world of chaos. I'd attached it all with a mixture of PVC cement and sheer willpower. The resulting contraption was crude, an unsightly appendage to the otherwise unobtrusive guttering. But its purpose was elegant in its simplicity, and its potential for disruption immeasurable. It was a direct line, a watery pipeline from my property to hers. A conduit for the very element she likely viewed as a threat to her immaculate landscaping. The first fat drops began to fall, splattering against the patio furniture with a sound like tiny, excited applause. A gust of wind swept through, rustling the leaves of the oak tree at the edge of my property, a tree that, I suspected, would also be subject to Mrs. Periwinkle's scrutiny if it dared to shed its leaves with too much abandon. The sky had turned a bruised, ominous purple. The air crackled with an energy that was both exhilarating and a little terrifying. I stood, my arms crossed, a strange sense of calm settling over me. It wasn't the calm of resignation, but the calm of a predator who has finally cornered its prey. Mrs. Periwinkle, with her iron grip on the neighborhood's aesthetic, her draconian rules, her utter disdain for anything that didn't fit her narrow definition of perfection, was about to face a force she couldn't control with a sternly worded letter or a passive-aggressive sigh. She was about to face nature. Or at least nature's slightly more organized, human-assisted version. The rain intensified, no longer tentative drops, but a steady, drumming cascade. I could hear it hitting the roof, a percussive symphony that grew louder with each passing moment. I imagined the water, a relentless, silver stream, flowing down my gutters, reaching the junction. And then, oh, the glorious redirection. It would surge through the PVC pipe, a miniature floodgate opening, and spill forth, not onto the carefully curated petunias she favored, but onto the very heart of her domain, her pristine, immaculately maintained porch. I pictured the water pooling, spreading, a shimmering, unwelcome tide creeping across the polished wood. I saw the carefully arranged wicker furniture being nudged, the miniature decorative gnomes she insisted on displaying being sent tumbling. I envisioned the water seeping into the cracks, staining the wood, a tangible manifestation of my defiance. It wouldn't be a deluge to cause structural damage, nothing so dramatic. It would be a persistent, inconvenient, undeniably wet presence. A constant reminder that order could be disrupted, that control was an illusion, and that sometimes even the most meticulously manicured surface could be overwhelmed. A shiver, not entirely from the cool evening air, traced its way down my spine. This was more than just reclaiming my rainwater barrel. This was a statement. A declaration of independence from the tyranny of perfect lawns and arbitrary rules. It was a petty act, I knew. A childish, almost vindictive act. But after weeks of simmering resentment, of feeling bulldozed and dismissed, it felt necessary. It felt like justice, albeit a very damp form of it. I walked to my window, peering through the rain-streaked glass at her sprawling mansion, its porch lights casting an almost theatrical glow onto the wet pavement. I could almost see her, Agnes Periwinkle, the undisputed queen of Willow Creek Estates, perhaps enjoying a quiet evening with a cup of herbal tea, blissfully unaware of the watery rebellion brewing just a few houses down. Or perhaps she was already contemplating the next infraction, the next neighbor to subtly berate, the next rule to enforce with an iron fist clad in a lace glove. My lips curved into a slow, satisfied smile. The rain was coming down in earnest now, a torrential downpour that would test the limits of even the most robust gutter system. I imagined the sound of it hitting her porch, a sound that would be far less soothing than the crickets, far more insistent than the distant hum of a lawnmower. It would be the sound of my quiet rebellion, amplified. I wondered, fleetingly, if she would emerge, if she would stand there, arms crossed, her glacial eyes narrowed in fury, trying to pinpoint the source of this unexpected deluge. Would she blame a rogue squirrel, a sudden, unseasonal spring? Or would she, in her most private moments, suspect the truth? Would she realize that the quiet, unassuming man down the street, the one who dared to collect rainwater, had found a way to fight back? The thought sent another thrill through me. It was a delicious thought, a vindication that warmed me from the inside out, despite the encroaching chill. I knew this was just the beginning. This act of watery defiance was merely the opening salvo. The barrel was gone, a symbol of her power. But the rain was mine to direct. And I had a feeling that Mrs. Periwinkle's Porch was just the first of many places in Willow Creek Estates that would soon experience a taste of my newfound, hydro-powered ingenuity. The night was young, the rain was falling, and my gutters were singing a song of sweet, sweet revenge. The first fat drops splattered on the patio furniture, dark polka dots on the pale wicker. It was a hesitant start, a mere whisper of the deluge to come. But for me, it was the overture to a symphony of sweet, watery justice. I stood on my porch, a steaming mug of chamomile tea clutched in my hand, a deceptive picture of calm. Inside, however, a mild inferno of anticipation raged. The PVC pipe, a stark white appendage to my otherwise unassuming gutter, jutted out like a defiant finger, aimed with surgical precision at the heart of Mrs. Periwinkle's meticulously curated domain. I watched as the drizzle intensified, coalescing into streaks on the windowpane, each one a tiny harbinger of doom for Agnes Periwinkle's spotless stoop. The air grew heavy, charged with the promise of rain, and for me, the electrifying thrill of impending retribution. It had been days since the Great Barrel Heist, days of stewing in a potent broth of indignation and righteous fury. My fescue had continued its slow, mournful browning, a visible testament to her petty tyranny. My meticulously planned composting efforts, so reliant on that stolen reservoir, were in disarray. But more than the practical inconveniences, it was the sheer audacity that gnawed at me. The brazen, galling theft of my property, followed by her icy denial and thinly veiled condescension. It was an affront to my very sense of order, a violation of the unspoken compact that governed our suburban existence. And now, order was about to be served. Not the rigid, suffocating order she championed, but a chaotic, natural order, delivered with a decidedly un-HOA-approved panache. The rain began to fall in earnest. The gentle patter escalated to a steady drumming on the roof, a percussive buildup to the main event. I could see the downpour hitting the street, turning the asphalt slick and dark. A lone rogue squirrel, momentarily startled by the sudden downpour, darted across my lawn and disappeared into the dense foliage of a neighbor's oak. It was a creature of nature, unburdened by covenants and regulations, free to scurry and hoard as it pleased. Oh, to be a squirrel. My gaze drifted across the street, towards the sprawling mansion that was Agnes Periwinkle's fortress of conformity. Her porch, a veritable temple of polished concrete, was currently as dry as a summer lecture on lawn maintenance. Miguel, her gardener, a man whose stoicism was as impenetrable as his employer's rules, was nowhere to be seen. He was likely tucked away somewhere, meticulously polishing his trowels or perhaps alphabetizing the garden gnomes. Then it happened. The gutters on my house, their usual duty of gently channeling water away from the foundation, were suddenly tasked with something far more dramatic. The PVC extension, a simple yet ingenious contraption I'd fashioned from spare parts and sheer desperation, began to work its magic. The water, instead of flowing into the downspout, was rerouted, gathered, and funneled. It was a controlled torrent, a miniature river born from the sky and my own ingenuity. I watched, my heart thrumming a triumphant rhythm against my ribs, as the first significant stream of water gushed from the end of the PVC pipe. It arced, a glistening silver ribbon against the gray sky, and landed with a decisive splish on the edge of Mrs. Periwinkle's porch. A small dark stain bloomed on the pristine concrete, a tiny mark of rebellion. A slow smile spread across my face. It was working. Oh, it was gloriously, beautifully working. The rain intensified, the sky opening up in a full-blown downpour. My gutters were working overtime, and so was my PVC pipe. The stream of water grew stronger, more insistent. It wasn't just a dribble anymore. It was a steady, focused cascade, a liquid missile aimed with unwavering intent. It struck the porch again and again and again. The small dark stains merged, growing larger, creating a miniature, rapidly expanding lake. I took a sip of my tea, the warmth a comforting counterpoint to the cool, damp air and the simmering heat of my satisfaction. I imagined Agnes Periwinkle inside her fortress, perhaps sipping Earl Grey, her perfectly coiffed silver hair gleaming, blissfully unaware of the watery insurrection unfolding just yards away. Or perhaps she was aware. Perhaps she was already seething, her glacial eyes narrowing as she witnessed the desecration of her sacred porch. The thought sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated pleasure through me. The initial impact was subtle, a mere inconvenience. But as the rain continued its relentless assault, the volume of water increased. The stream from my gutter became a veritable waterfall, thundering down onto her porch. The water began to pool, then to flow, creating miniature rivulets that snaked across the concrete. It was a miniature flood, a localized deluge, all thanks to my humble gutter modification. I took another slow sip of tea, my eyes never leaving the spectacle across the street. I could almost hear the faint, muffled sounds of her house, the ticking of a grandfather clock, the distant hum of a meticulously maintained air conditioning unit, the rustle of expensive silk as she paced. But soon, those sounds would be drowned out by the growing roar of water, the very element she so carefully managed and controlled in her meticulously manicured garden. Brenda, my erstwhile informant, chose that moment to make an appearance. She emerged from her own house, clutching a bright pink umbrella as if it were a shield against the elements. She paused on her driveway, her gaze, no doubt, drawn to the unusual aquatic display across the street. I saw her head tilt, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even amusement, crossing her face. She knew. Of course, she knew. Brenda was the neighborhood's primary conduit for all things gossip, and this was undoubtedly the most exciting development Willow Creek Estates had seen since the Great Flamingo debacle of '19. She waved, a little too enthusiastically, her umbrella bobbing like a buoy. I gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that said, "Yes, this is happening. And yes, it's glorious." She then proceeded to walk towards her own porch, pausing again to cast a furtive glance towards Mrs. Periwinkle's property, her lips pursed in what I could only assume was a silent, delighted gasp. The water level on Mrs. Periwinkle's porch was now significant. It was no longer just pooling. It was actively cascading down the steps, forming a small, muddy stream that then flowed onto her impossibly green lawn. The edges of her meticulously edged flower beds, usually so crisp and defined, were beginning to soften, blurred by the encroaching water. The petunias, so carefully arranged, were being battered by the relentless spray. It was a scene of utter, beautiful, natural chaos. I imagined Miguel, the gardener, being summoned from his sanctuary. I pictured him emerging, his brow furrowed, his usually impassive face creased with concern as he surveyed the watery devastation. Would he understand? Would he comprehend the subtle yet potent message being delivered? Or would he simply fetch a mop and bucket, his mind tragically devoid of the poetic justice unfolding before him? The rain showed no signs of abating. If anything, it was picking up speed, the wind whipping the water into a frenzy. My gutter, my humble, modified gutter, was performing admirably. It was channeling the downpour with unwavering dedication, a relentless one-man demolition crew. The PVC pipe, a simple piece of plastic, had become an instrument of anarchy. I found myself chuckling, a low, rumbling sound that mingled with the drumming rain. It was a petty act, I knew, a childish tit-for-tat retaliation. But after weeks of simmering resentment, of feeling powerless against Mrs. Periwinkle's suffocating control, it felt profoundly satisfying. It was a reclaiming of agency, a small but significant act of defiance against the tyranny of perfectly manicured lawns and enforced aesthetic uniformity. I finished my tea, the last lukewarm drops a final punctuation mark to my vigil. The porch across the street was a veritable water park, a stark contrast to its former dry dignity. The water was now creeping towards the front door, a dark stain spreading across the polished wood. It was a visual metaphor, I thought, for the disruption I was bringing to her carefully constructed world. I wondered briefly if this was enough, if this watery assault would be sufficient to convey my displeasure, my outrage, or would she simply see it as a plumbing issue, a consequence of poor drainage exacerbated by the weather? But no, I knew Agnes Periwinkle. She was too astute, too attuned to the subtle undercurrents of Willow Creek Estates. She would know. She would recognize the deliberate nature of the assault, the precision with which it had been executed. She would know it was me. And that, in itself, was a victory. The knowledge that I, Arthur Pendleton, the quiet man who prided himself on sustainable practices and a well-behaved fescue, had managed to disrupt her meticulously ordered existence, even in this small, watery way. As the rain continued to pour, turning her porch into a flowing river, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The inferno of anticipation had cooled, replaced by a quiet, contented glow. The mystery of why she'd stolen my barrel remained, a lingering question mark in the waterlogged landscape. But for now, the immediate, pressing need for vengeance had been satisfied. My gutters had sung their song of defiance, and Agnes Periwinkle's porch had been forced to listen. The game, I suspected, was far from over. But for today, the rain had spoken, and its message was clear. Order could be disrupted, and even the most pristine porch was not immune to the cascading consequences of a stolen rainwater barrel. I turned from the window, a small, satisfied sigh escaping my lips. It was a good day to be Arthur Pendleton. The rain, a relentless percussion against the roof, continued its symphony of defiance. From my patio, hidden behind the protective embrace of my slightly browning fescue, I watched the spectacle unfold. It wasn't just rain. It was a carefully orchestrated deluge.